Hey, everybody, I'm Tom Barnes. This is Stories from the 78. And the best part, in my opinion, for the 78 is I get to help tell stories from all over the world. And this specific story, affects everybody in the world, but it's coming out of Phoenix, Arizona. I'm here with my friend, Preston Zeller. How are you, Preston?
Great. Thanks for having me on, Tom. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. And you did this documentary and this art project called The Art of Grieving, which is a very this is a very as personal as it gets, I think, for an art project and a documentary, putting yourself on film, your family on film, to talk about something that a lot of people in our society shy away from, when it has to do with somebody struggling and then they end up, passing on. That's a hard thing to do. And you did that. So that by itself, deserves some accolades just to put yourself out there.
No, I appreciate it. Yeah. And I have had a lot of people ask, like, why would you want to do something like that? It does seem like it's a lot of personal exposure in many ways, but that kind of sort of speaks to the subject in some manner that, like, I went the extreme opposite of not talking about it and decided to make a film about it.
Right. And is that something that you've done before in terms of like being the opposite of not talking about feelings and stuff like that? It was like, or were you always that kind of person where like, I need to get this stuff out?
Yeah, I'm a talker. I mean, it's
Me
funny.
too.
I yeah, I've been married for almost 11 years, and my wife grew up in a family where it was, it wasn't as talked about, all these kind of things, and so I think she found it probably rather annoying when we first got together because I'm like, "What's the matter? Tell me about it."
Ditto. um, so tell people the story in general, because I know, and when you tell it, did you do art prior to this? That was one of the questions I had going into this, is because you just took on a project itself that was 365 individual pieces that became this big piece that's in your house, and we'll talk about all that. But the essence of why this whole project started.
Yeah, so I mean, the art of grieving really, it's essentially about my relationship with my brother, but that's like a tee up to my response to my brother dying. So February 2019, my brother died from a drug overdose, and so I've been an artist my whole life, and I think this project was this really crazy culmination of a lot of my pursuits in life. I mean, I went to film school in Southern California, and was making film for a while, worked in the film industry for a bit. I didn't eventually I didn't pursue the traditional world of film, and so, but I've also been a musician for a long time, other creative pursuits. I've published work in a variety of mediums, so you know taking on and seeing through a creative project end to end is something I'm pretty used to, actually. And but this was like a combination again of all those types of things. But painting was something I did in high school. I did it when I was younger as well. I started to get into abstract in high school and studying cubism. And I got back into physical painting in 2018. So the year prior, I had been so entrenched in everything computer, graphic design and branding and just the whole gamut of design. But I just got so sick of the, I guess, the ability to push undo in any kind of graphic design
Oh,
program and
sure,
create
yeah.
layers. I was like, it just felt like cheating to me. I'm like, no, and look, graphic design is fantastic, and there's a place for that, but I wanted to be able to work with a physical medium that, like painting. And given my life experiences at that point, I'm a father of three and I'm married, and so knowing that, like, all these things kind of bring something out of you. But then when my brother passed away, I just knew instinctively, I'm like, oh my gosh, I have to pour this into a creative outlet. It's something I've had done through my whole life, but not in that dramatic of of an event yet. And so that's sort of what prompted at least the initial kind of painting of some bigger pieces I did once he passed.
Right. And then you turned all the other pieces, I'm reading this right, 10 by 20-foot mosaic in your house. You documented the entire thing in a documentary film process. So, like you were talking before about all the things that you've done prior to that, it's always funny to me when I talk to people and I look at myself. When you go through things in your life, you always wonder, why am I doing this if I didn't end up doing
Yeah.
it and all this? And then all of a sudden you work on a project where you're like, oh, this is why I did all that stuff 10 years ago and I had no idea. But I mean, your film had to be just a grieving process in itself to do it, right? And then you put it up on it's on Amazon Prime. You send it to film festivals. It's won a best documentary, a few film festivals. So this really has touched, struck a chord with people. Talk about the process from, you starting off. I mean, you included your family in this. You're on the trampoline with your kids. You're talking to people in your family about all this. Were they like, yeah, let's do this, let's go in all in, or was it like convincing, or was it all a grieving process for everybody just because of how close of a family member that passed been being your brother?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, the decision to do this, I will say, like, it was 6, 7 months after my brother passed. I told, of course, my wife about it, and then, my sister and parents and, different family members. And their initial response was like, that kind of seems intense or overkill or crazy, and I'm like, I'm used to that response when I go to do certain things. So I'm like, okay, fine. I get it. My wife is incredibly supportive. She may not get it at first either, but she goes along and is, again, so supportive in that way. But I didn't want to get too distracted with things that I didn't feel like were really relevant to the documentary and in the message I was trying to tell. Because you think about what message you want to tell in a documentary, right? It can go so many different ways, and I can tell
Sure.
you, any documentary you watch, especially a docu-series, they are dealing with probably hundreds of hours of interviews and whittling that down to a story. And there's details you miss because maybe it starts to tell something that the director doesn't want, or it's not consistent with the through line of the story. And that's one of the challenges. And so I knew for myself, at least in that first, that the first act of it really, which is setting up, who I am, who my brother was, our relationship, some of my life circumstances. It's like I need it to be relatable, right? And so,
Hmm.
and in a similar sense too, it's like, well, how do I bring in the other parts of my family that I did grow up with, like my parents and like my sister and his wife. But I knew they wouldn't want to be in it per se, and I didn't want it to be about that, because to me it was very much a sibling story at the end of the day, for us particularly. And that's like there's a whole community of sibling loss, and they call it like sibling survivors. I was just doing a podcast about that recently, because that it's kind of this overlooked segment of grief in some ways, where
Sure.
the sibling relationship, because of the nature of the loss, is it carries a different component to it. But yeah, so including, I think, my family was really important to this, and particularly because as I painted every day for a year, and so it ended up with 365 paintings. And my wife and kids were really in the trenches of that, because it would be like, every day I would have a new painting, and I would
Yeah,
share
no
that painting
pressure.
with my kids. Yeah, I would share that painting with my kids, and it actually became this sort of fun routine we had, where I would show them the painting, and I'd asked my kids what they thought it meant. So there's this year where they were like getting this schooling and like interpreting abstract art in some ways. And then I think it wasn't until it came together that my wife was like, I get it now. Because there's some paintings that you're like, oh, that looks really good, and some paintings that she's like, that looks, like a 5-year-old did it or something. That was her commentary to me, which I'm like, okay, that's fine, and that was
It was
part of
every
the
day for 365 days. Come on, give me a break here.
right. Well, that's the funny thing, and part of why I was like gonna do it public again. We talked about this sort of like counter, um, just doing things against the stream. Artists are really good at censoring themselves, right? Like, it isn't until 20 years after the band is successful where you hear the raw demos of like the famous album or something.
Sure.
But God forbid they put that out ahead of time, because then it would diminish the value. Like, you just don't see people's creative process in nowadays. It's just everything's got to be so polished.
Right.
So in essence, part of the process was also, as a creative person, saying, you know what, I know out of that many paintings, surely there's going to be a good portion of them that people may not like. I don't care. And there's ones I don't like, but that wasn't the exercise. The exercise was, I'm trying to tap into, of course, the emotional loss of my brother. So,
And doing it through art therapy, essentially, really getting that emotion down on the canvas. Was there specific things that you thought of each day that you wanted, or was it more of a what came to you is what became the art piece?
yeah, I mean, for the most part, it was very much trying to just paint and not be like dwelling on a particular subject. Um, and that's like, in intuitive abstract or abstract expressionism, however you want to call it. That's really the approach you take. And I actually thought about this because, so musically, I studied like blues theory and whatnot, because I enjoy improving uh, on chord progressions. And that's the same thing. You ever watch someone rip a solo in a concert? That's what they're doing. It's just this like, eminence of however they're feeling at the time, and they know how to manipulate a guitar or whatever instrument they're watching.
Sure.
For improv, jazz is like the epitome of that, freeform jazz. But painting for me is the same kind of process. I there are times where I sat down and was just like, okay, because of the routine, it was easy to shut it off. And there are other times where I had to be a lot more intentional about, like, mid painting, I find myself kind of judging what I'm doing um, versus just merely painting. And I had to, develop some rigor about shutting that off. And the last painting was really the painting that I premeditated the most, because I was using my brother's ashes and I didn't want to be like kind of flippant with what I was painting there.
Right. And that was a pupil, right? Where you kind of sprinkled his remains in the paint to show the people in an abstract way. And I'd be remiss if I didn't say your brother's name, Colin.
Yeah.
He was your brother, and that had to be really, I don't know. Like, I don't even know how to explain. I mean, you're the one who
Yeah.
did it. So, like, I mean, what made you need to have him included in that last piece?
Um, I had done some paintings with like I use primarily acrylic, so I'm not an oil painter, but I I wouldn't be patient enough for the pace at which oil dries. But I will mess around with different things. Like, I mix rubbing alcohol into the paint sometimes, or I'll use it to dilute it. It breaks the pigments apart at different times, charcoal, things like that. And so messing around with, over that whole year, I was like kind of messing around with different types of texture, heavy, medium type paintings. Um, and then I just kept thinking about, I'm like, okay, I'm doing all this. painting, and I knew we had ashes. I was trying to get some, and knew I think my parents had some, my sister-in-law, and then my parents. And it seemed like a very, I don't know, normal thing for me to do at the end of it. Now, was I prepared for like that experience? No, I had never. I mean, how many of us ever handle physical
Yeah.
remains? Even if you get them right, I mean, most people, it's like this sacred thing that you don't touch, or
Right.
if you
You know,
go
they don't.
spread them, I have a cup or whatever it is, you don't have it in your hand. And talk about a really surreal experience, because I don't know. For me, if you've ever seen the movie Big Lebowski,
Yeah.
that that's for I've seen so many movies. You think about that coffee can scene where he's shaking out Steve Buscemi's character, and it's going into the dude's beard, and
Did that
I
run through
thought,
your mind as you're doing it? Like, I can't screw this up. I don't want to, like, I would, that would be, I don't know. I'd be nuts in that moment.
well, and my point of bringing up that scene partially is like you think of it as this like really fine dust, and it's not. It's pulverized bone is what cremation ashes are basically.
Hmm.
But there's still like chunks of it. So I scan, all of these paintings that are really high resolution, and there's like pretty large bone fragments actually in the painting. That's where I think looking at some of those pieces, it gets very eerie. And I'm not like, it's not about the dead to me, in a way. Like, it's not meant to be this morbid thing. It's more meant to be this honoring thing, and actually just experiment. And I have met other painters, like very few, who have done that kind of thing. Some people mix it in, pottery or different things like that. But I, my wife was the one there, like filming it on her phone. I think that's the footage in the movie. And I don't say this point, but because there was like initially I felt like weird. Oh, this is done, and then I just saw my wife crying, and I bawled.
Sure.
Uh,
How can
and
you not,
I
right?
yeah, and I kind of follow up on that sentiment though in when we embrace at the end of like the light show scene. So yeah, very bizarre experience for sure, handling ashes. And so I've done that for other people since then. I use gloves to handle those, but yeah.
And you mentioned the light show. You over 4,000 backlights on this mosaic that's in your house that you had to have a scissors lift, like help get all that stuff up there. You had some friends kind of help you. Like, it was all like a big project. Was it one of those things too? You're like, no, this is how we need to finish it. And the family's like, oh, okay, sure. Like, it's a documentary, and now there's going to be this painting in the house. Okay, sure. Like, Preston, you do you. We'll just be here to support.
Well, of course, when I was staring at that wall, and this was like in the middle of COVID stuff too. So I had moved to, Austin, Texas area late 2019, and um, early 2020, the world gets all whacked out, and my intent was to finish this, have a gallery showing, that kind of thing. And I actually originally wanted to do like 3/4 of the documentary and then have a physical showing, film that, and then have that be like the last quarter of it. That got totally thrown off. And so I was staring at this wall that seemed like perfectly made for it, and going, I think I made a, passing comment to my wife at one point that, hey, maybe we'll put it up here. And she's like, no. And then later, yeah, later on, I'm like, I think we have to do this. And so she's like, okay, fine. But yeah, it's interesting. The light show aspect of it was the biggest unknown, because the paintings aren't laid out sequentially. I had to recreate a separate image in Adobe Illustrator. I kind of shrunk all these down to a scale size so I could play with them like a reverse puzzle. And so that I could see the image on a small scale. I knew roughly what that would look like on a computer screen, but the lights I didn't. There's no way to simulate that. I think I had like 7 I had put down, and I laid the paintings on top just to make sure the light would come through enough. And then I'm like, oh, great, let's do this on the whole thing. So when the light show came on, that was like the most just mind-blowing aspect of it, because no one had seen that, including myself. And actually the song in the movie, that was actually really the first song we did play when that happened. So I was trying to recreate that moment in some ways.
Right. And seeing your project with light on it like that, I imagine it's like seeing it all in a completely different way, almost like for the first time all over again, where it's just a different experience altogether.
Yeah, and that, I think the fun part of that is it became like, there's so many, once you turned it off, you turn all the lights off. So we like people who would stay with us or some family friends, um, we just called it the light show and be like, hey, do you want to watch a light show? But like, okay, don't know what to expect, right? And then so we just shut off all the lights and we turned it on, and we would, there are some times where we played a couple songs. There are some times we'd sit there for like an hour and a half, 2 hours just playing songs, and people would point out different parts of the mosaic because because of the way the lights are kind of dancing to it. Like there's one painting above that several people said just looked like a heartbeat while the
Oh, it's
music
very
was
cool.
playing. Yeah, and so it just gave like a totally different experience to looking at it. um and of course playing the music made it all the more special. So
I imagine though, having other people react to something that you created in a way where you didn't even see perhaps the heartbeat, but they're seeing it, that just, I imagine that just makes you feel even more connected to for why you did it, because people, and I think this is also a lesson of the documentary itself, is that people have been grieving since the beginning of time.
yeah,
And I'm guessing this process has taught you not only about how you grieve, especially when it's so close with your brother, but how the family grieves, but just in general, the human race and how we have grieved over time, and really a lesson in that.
for sure. Yeah, and so there's that historical component of the documentary. And I've had people, that was actually kind of a funny controversial part when we were doing like test screenings. There are some people that are like, I don't get the history, and then there are people who come back that are like, can you make a documentary just about the history? Like, and I'm like, okay, well, that's not the point of this. But I knew that it adds this dimension to it that kind of reinforces that all of us doing whatever we are to work through grief. Like, yeah, you're right, it's been going on forever. um I think one of the more interesting things there is where you see like cultural examples of
Yeah.
particularly processing grief. I think there's a lot of rituals that still exist around like the dead, what you do for a ceremony, but what happens after that. And we're such, people are so connected today, and in some ways I think maybe disconnected from their cultural heritage. So you don't, what did my ancestors do? And there's, I think, an opportunity for the families and individuals to figure out something that you can actually like maybe pass down to your kids as something that you can do with them, or that's helpful for them, when a family member passes or a friend.
Yeah, I've done a lot of stories here in the Chicago area at certain cemeteries that have been around since 1700s, and
Hmm.
some of the cemeteries were designed to be like not a cemetery. They were designed to be like this a park where people
Hmm.
can go to the cemetery and grieve with their loved ones in a place of beauty. So these
Mm,
cemeteries, you walk in there and there, there's ponds, there's big, beautiful trees, there's architecture within the cemetery. And you listen to the tour guide, and they're like, "Oh no, this was designed to be like a park where people can
mhm.
just come and be with their loved ones." And that was a way of that culture that settled here in the Chicago area, decided to honor the loved ones that have passed. But this documentary speaks volumes to me. He wasn't my brother by blood, but he was my brother because I grew up with him. He lived with
Yeah.
my family and he lived with me in college. He was the friend that went to college with me but didn't go to college. He just lived with me in my apartment.
Yeah.
And he was my brother through and through, and I lost him during COVID.
Mm,
So just to hear it from your perspective, and with your brother and dealing with that. My friend also he had issues. He wasn't, nobody's perfect, first of all, but he had issues that were vices for him that put him in a position to not be able to fight COVID. You know what I mean? And it
mm,
ended up
yeah.
taking his life. But either way, to put your story out there, I imagine trying to tell that story about him. And then I reflect on what you did with your brother and the grieving process. I mean, it's something that's remarkable to be able to do it in a way that you did and turn it into such a positive experience for people to be able to watch how you did it. That's really something special.
No, I appreciate that, Tom, and I appreciate you too sharing about your brother from another mother. It sounds like
Yeah, Big D, Daryl was his name.
Daryl.
Yeah. Um, but yeah, he was my brother. I mean, we lived together in an apartment, in college. Your brother's right there. Even in high school, he lived with me and my family. But yeah, just watching this, it made me reflect a lot about that time in my life with him, and then and it was during the pandemic. How do you cope when somebody passes during the pandemic where you can't even go and see them? Like it was just such
Right.
a weird time. So I imagine that lots of people had that issue with losing somebody close to them in the pandemic or in life in general. And to see it done with art therapy and understanding human history the way that you put it out there, and to the lengths that you'll go to want to be able to express yourself, is incredible. Because I mean, I to do something for 365 days is a lot, right? It's a lot.
Mm.
And it's a time commitment. It's also just holding yourself accountable, which I imagine there are probably days you don't want to do it.
No, for sure. Yeah, I mean, and I kind of touched on that a bit, but and that's like the essence of grief in some ways. It's just there, um, whether you like it or not, and it's you're having the emotional um, tsunamis come over you, and you're like, I wasn't thinking about, Daryl today. I wasn't thinking about this thing, but it's here nonetheless. And I'm either going to confront it or I'm going to push it down. And that's the scarier thing in many ways. Like, you push it down, and then could be however long later, hopefully not at the end of your life, where you realize, oh my gosh, there's so much more I could have uncovered here and learned about myself, and I ignored that. That's kind of a tragic way to go.
Right. And people either, like you said, either they lean into it and accept it or push it down. And then by pushing it down, it sends them on a different path. Perhaps that's not healthy because they're not letting things out. And I think that's important for people. There's no right way to grieve. You just grieve how you need to grieve. As long as you're not hurting other people in the process, is about the only way that it's
Right.
not okay to grieve. But outside of that, you got to do what you got to do. But this film, your journey, your story, I think gives people a perspective perhaps maybe they didn't think that they can do, like really turn to art to help themselves express their feelings and grieve. And people can find more information about that through your website. Why don't you hand that out here, and then where people can find the documentary?
Yeah, and I appreciate it. If you go to theartofgrievingfilm.com, you can find the latest streaming locations. Amazon Prime is the biggest one, of course, and then there's others. There's also, some interviews, like this one will be there eventually as well. And If you want to learn more about any of the kind of like different associations with the film, you can find it there. And then yeah, I'm on Instagram primarily as well, just Preston Zeller if you want to look me up there.
Fantastic. Preston, thank you very much for sharing your story. I really appreciate it. And, thank you for putting that out there for people to see. It helped me. So, and I imagine it'll help many, many, many other people.
Cool. Thanks so much, Tom. Appreciate it.
Sure.